for RTX 3090. We're going to build two separate systems with SLI 3090. We're going to see, is there anything in it? Is it cool? Or is it really a huge waste of time? I think you guys are going to be very surprised by the entire process and what happens at the end. Let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. They say that every time you smash the like button, SLI gets closer and closer to being at least usable to some extent. Well, alright, so let's talk about it for RTX 3090. So before we even talk about the video, let's talk about really the big elephant in the room here, and that's going to be having 4 RTX 3090. Now, in the beginning, a few months ago, it was a lot easier than now to even get the RTX 3090s, and I got all of these way before sort of the prices went up at the beginning of the year. The Founders Edition 3090 were fairly easy to get compared to the 3080 and the other GPUs when it came out last year. First, we were able to get one from nvidia itself, and then Best Buy did have various drops, so that's pretty much how I got those two. And then the EVGA for the Win 3 3090 were actually fairly widely available at the end of last year. I was able to get it through the EVGA queue, and even for a while, Micro Center had a decent amount of these 3090s, and of course these were when the prices were still at least the original MSRP. And now of course they're much more difficult to find, and just to show that I'm not hogging all the GPUs, I even gave away my very own 3080 at the end of last year to one of my viewers, and he was very happy. So at least I just want to mention these things because I know people are going to mention comments about multiple 3090s, and there's already enough to go through here with SLI itself being useful or not. So a little history here. Why even do this? Well, when the 10 series were around, like the 1080 Ti, SLI was definitely still a thing, but rapidly decreasing in not only usability but also popularity. It seemed like nvidia wasn't really supporting it very much, and while some games did work well in SLI with like two 1080 Ti's, most games were pretty much useless, and you had to use nvidia inspector and do various things to even make profiles work. So back then I was already pretty ready to give up on SLI. The reason that people like SLI, like myself, it's not really even like a value for the money thing. It's mostly because as a tech enthusiast, you want to push not only the performance but the visual aspects of your build even further, and having multiple GPUs historically has been a way to do that. I understand it's a very niche and specialized sort of market, but it did exist, and for a while it was pretty cool to do. So as soon as the 1080 Ti was sort of nearing its end and the 2080 Ti was going to come out, I got a bit excited again because nvidia was once again pushing the new NVLink bridge. It's still technically SLI the connection, but it is called the NVLink bridge. They were saying that this bridge is much more powerful than the previous bridge for the 1080 Ti, so I thought, so if they're really pushing this new NVLink standard, they probably know that there's a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline, so they're going to make the 2080 Ti really powerful GPUs if you pair two of them. So when the 2080 Ti was released, I went and I got two with the NVLink bridge, and I just sort of waited around and nothing really seemed to happen. The support was pretty much like it was back in the 1080 Ti days. I was fairly disappointed that dual GPU really seemed to not be implemented in any way that nvidia sort of had insinuated when they first announced the 2080 Ti. And of course, similarly, ray tracing took a long time to pick up. You could say that now is really when ray tracing and DLSS are starting to pick up steam. Back then, nvidia promised that technology, but it was really nowhere to be seen. So I figured maybe the same would happen with SLI and NVLink, with ray tracing and all these new technologies. Maybe nvidia was going to find a way to actually push it and make it work well, but it seems like as the 3000 series GPUs came out, SLI became pretty much dead. Now the only GPU that can even take advantage of the NVLink bridge is the RTX 3090. The 3080 and below pretty much non-existent for any type of SLI support. So as we've seen that brief history, I know more than anyone that SLI has been pretty dead and useless for a very long time, but it doesn't keep you from wanting to try it. There are various reasons why you would want to try SLI. Let's talk about a few. Even now with the RTX 3090, even though very few games support it, a couple do, and when you do turn it on and you do use SLI in these games, it is certainly impressive to see some of the frames per second gains that you get, but generally, since not very many games supported, and the ones that do are not necessarily even the latest titles like Cyberpunk 2077. The other thing you can do when you have two GPUs is do some type of like competitive benchmarking like 3D Mark or something like that, which certainly is a lot of fun. You can get up on the leaderboards. When the 4013 first came out and I had those in SLI, I did try, and even without doing too many modifications, I was able to get pretty high in the Port Royal score. I think I was like top 20 in the world or something like that. So that's certainly a lot of fun to do. Didn't require a lot of effort, but it is fun to push it little by little. So those are basically going to be some of the biggest reasons for SLI GPUs. And then of course, remember, you can have multiple GPUs in your system and not have to rely on NVLink or SLI. A lot of programs like, for example, rendering, 3D rendering, even video rendering programs like DaVinci Resolve, they will take advantage of multiple GPUs, even if you don't have an NVLink bridge. In fact, that NVLink bridge in a lot of cases can actually degrade performance on a powerful GPU, especially when you're using it with something like DaVinci Resolve. So in a lot of cases, having two GPUs in the workstation can actually make a lot of sense. So, okay, we know that for games and for most things, SLI is actually pretty useless. So let's talk about the last thing remaining, and that's actually the physical part of SLI in the system. After all, when you're building custom computers, it's not only about the best performance you're getting for the dollar, there's also trying the new technologies, the aesthetics. There's actually a lot that goes on with building a computer. So the first 3090 GPUs that I got in SLI, these were the EVGA for the Win 3. Very quickly, I came to realize a lot of things. First, they are very difficult to fit in the case, and I put it in the Case Labs SMA8. Basically, this is a massive, massive case, and even on an X570 godlike motherboard, which does have the 4-slot spacing, and that comes on another good point. Not every motherboard is going to support 3090s because you basically need 4-slot spacing. For like the AMD Ryzen, you basically only have the X570 godlike, some maybe like a Z390 godlike will work. X299 Intel, there are a couple like X299 Dark. The Rampage 6 Extreme will also have that 4-slot spacing, and also some of the Threadripper motherboards. Even inserting a huge GPU like the 4013, I actually had a considerable amount of trouble even getting the motherboard to read the GPU. I had to make sure that the NVMe drive was not in the top slot but in the bottom. The X570 godlike just has the PCIe lanes distribution like that. Some go off the CPU, off the chipset, and in a lot of cases the actual physical connection between the second GPU and the motherboard was actually fairly difficult. It almost seemed like the motherboard wasn't aligned with the GPU to sit all the way in. Just because of the way that the motherboard is designed, you really do have to push the GPU in fairly carefully and with some effort in order to get the little latch to close, or else in many cases when I first booted up, one GPU would show, the second one wouldn't show up, and then I would physically have to adjust them. And then after a lot of adjusting, that's when they finally would show up. Right away, I saw that doing SLI, not only is it really, really useless for most things aside from benchmarking or things like that, it actually gives you a lot more difficulty even before you water cool these blocks. And talking about water cooling, before I water cooled and I had the air cooler on these two EVGA for the Win 3, they got extremely hot. Because both GPUs have to be fairly close to each other, they certainly got extremely hot, and the fans had to ramp up a pretty considerable amount, therefore really negating any type of real benefit to having these sort of more expensive GPUs with the better coolers. In fact, the first thing I thought is that I can't wait for the water blocks to come out for these GPUs because they really require to be water cooled, or else they're just going to be way too hot, way too powerful. Even in a large case like this, you would just have to have like a ridiculous amount of airflow to even make them function normally. And then when I finally got the water blocks for the EVGA for the Win 3, it makes a massive difference. The GPUs now usually go under like 50 degrees Celsius. And talking about the VRAM, the T Junction temperature, I know a lot of people probably want to know if water cooling these GPUs helped with the VRAM temperatures. Generally, they'd be around 100 degrees Celsius on the for the Win 3, and after I water cooled, it seemed like it went down to maybe 88 to 90 C if you're doing something really VRAM intensive. As you know, some GPUs like the Founder editions will go all the way up to 110. That's about the T Junction Junction Max. So at least the 4013 certainly has an improvement being water cooled, and in general the memory temperatures do run a good amount cooler than something like the Founders Edition. So when I finally put the Waterblock on the 4013, definitely a massive difference in improvement. Now the GPUs can actually be used in the same system just because you have so much radiator space sort of really taking care of the GPUs. And of course the physical connection was still a little bit finicky just because the motherboard, like I mentioned before, sometimes it's hard and you have to really make sure the GPU is seated correctly. And now when the GPUs are water cooled and they're connected by something like the EK Scalar bridge, which basically connects both GPUs, it's a lot harder to move a GPU around. Then of course let's talk about the second set of GPUs that I put in SLI, and that's the 3090 Founders Edition, and it's actually right behind me here. I use it to render, to do videos and things of that nature. Now the big difference between this and the 4013, they do actually run a bit cooler. They're a little bit quieter when you're doing, regular gaming and things like that. Now they do have that nice pass-through design, so I haven't put a water block on this yet, but I think I will, just because the difference is so massive between a non-water cooled GPU and something like this when you're talking about like thermals and noise and things of that nature. And of course the VRAM T junction temperatures are awful on these type of cards. If you stress the VRAM, these will easily hit 110 degrees Celsius and start to thermal throttle. I even took the back plate off and sort of put new thermal pads on, and while that did seem to make some improvement, I do think you're most likely going to have to water cool them in order to have an even bigger improvement in the T junction temperatures. But what I'm using them for now, I mean, it's more than okay. They're fairly quiet. They really only spin up when you're doing like a lot of rendering, and of course the fans are deafening at 100%, but generally during most workloads you really don't have to put the fans up anywhere near that high. And actually when we talk about the physical connection, this is the same X570 godlike motherboard that I'm using now. It was a lot easier for these GPUs to fit on the motherboard rather than the 4013. For some reason the 4013 is just a chunkier GPU. So in conclusion, is SLI worthless? Well, I think so for gaming, and unless you want to do some benchmarking and have some fun, it is pretty much worthless. Now the reason that I'm keeping both with the two GPUs in each, I'm not going to be really playing games in SLI or anything like that, but I am going to be using them to render for video work like DaVinci Resolve. So both systems will actually use both GPUs without even having to use an NVLink bridge. So for that it is useful. This is really only going to be good for workstation applications and creative apps and things like that, but for gaming, absolutely worthless. And it's actually fairly difficult to really get synced up and started. Like I mentioned before, the physical connection is tough. In a lot of cases, even to get SLI to activate in Windows, I had to go through so many hoops, uninstall software, restart, reinstall drivers, make sure everything's nicely put in, even PCIe lane consideration, make sure that you have enough PCIe bandwidth to make both GPUs work. So it's a massive headache for basically no gains. But if you're going to be doing workstation work and you need two GPUs, I still think that's certainly a go, and depending on the application, you'll definitely see some pretty nice benefit. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.